Welcome to the ScratchPad, where each week we give you a glimpse into the messy background of sermon creation. It's also a chance for you to ask some questions, so scratch that itch of yours and send in your questions. We'll do our best to answer them.
Welcome to the ScratchPad, a platform where we compare notes, your notes and the preacher's notes. I am Zwai Zulu, the pastor of discipleship here at Rosebank Union Church. Joining me today is the preacher of the week, Pastor Richard van Lieshout, and we are scratching it. We're continuing on our series in 1 Timothy. We tackled 1 Timothy chapter 6, the first two verses there. Rich, how did you feel? How do you feel about the sermon? And
I'm glad we extended the series. So, I was deliberating a lot because we were supposed to do chapter 6 all the way 1 to 10.
Yes, 1 to 10, yeah.
And even when we were outlining the series, I don't know if you remember, even like your notes, we had a little asterisk between verse 1 and 2. Or what do we do with it? Where do we put it? But just thought we'd kind of handle it when we got there. But then I got there and I'm like, no, I really think this is too big a deal. I think with the context of slavery, needing to unpack that, I think. Yes. And then just the whole workplace life, I realized, I hadn't yet really had an opportunity, Rosebank, yet to talk on the subject, and it's there. Exactly. It's part of these household codes. So I felt, I think it's quite important to deal with. And I think since we were moving to church in studio, that was part of the decision. It's like, man, if we have another week in the series in this different environment, maybe it's okay. So I'm really glad I did it. I know it threw the community groups out. So all those CG leaders listening, threw them out of their prep. But glad we did it, but no more extensions, so 2 more to go.
I'm happy we did that. I think because we are handling such a difficult topic, an important topic, to talk about. And I think I'll explain the difficulty, what I mean by the difficulty. But I think also for CG leaders, there are questions there that Pastor Rich has prepared that you can follow. I know groups are meeting tonight and some yesterday already, and the stuff has already been up online, so the questions are there.
True, yeah.
So but I think tackling it the way you have, I think it's helpful. But the reason I was mentioning the difficulty is when you're reading the Bible now, and we read of words as slavery, and it doesn't seem so appealing. Is the Bible pro-slavery? But I just think maybe the first place to start is how important is it that we understand the language of slavery? And you went into depth of that to deconstruct that.
Yeah, I felt I had to because of, I think, for some people, Christians and non-Christians alike, the question of does the Bible condone or even promote slavery is a major stumbling block still for some Christians. Like you often hear today when it comes to controversial current issues, it'll be like, well, is that just like the Bible condoning slavery? Using that as an example of only years later did Christians wake up to the injustice. And so it's still kind of this example being cited by Christians as something that's kind of, misunderstood and wrongly being used today. So, and then for non-Christians, I think for a lot of them, I think there used to be, I don't know if it's still current, or what your perspective is, but there used to be one of the major objections to the Bible and to Christianity. There's all these objections like, why does God allow suffering? Those kinds of questions. And then there's the slavery question. What about slavery? Like we know it's this grotesque injustice against humanity, but the Bible seems to condone it, if not promote it. And so I felt like just to take a moment to do that was important. To really just understand some of the text, and we'll go into a little more detail in this podcast, I think, around some of the slavery as it comes up in Old Testament. But I think it's important from that perspective because, the NIV version, which I read on Sunday, so we'll get into our ongoing translation debate. What's the current score, by the way? ESV versus NIV? It's 2-1 ESV. It's
2-1. I think you are leading,
Yes. ESV. So in verse 1, I think, as I read it on Sunday, it says bond servants.
Yes.
And NIV was just said slavery, and we'll get into that little translation battle in a moment. But the ESV very particularly translated it bondservant. In fact, the preface to the ESV, maybe I'll just find that quote real quick. So the preface to the ESV actually deliberately wants to applies words differently so that they can Let me just try to find it here. Distinguish between the sort of here it is, the different kind of ideas. So it's one word for slave is doulos. One word, but used in so many different ways. Sometimes in ways where it is literally in the sense of a master and a slave, and sometimes metaphorical. So, for example, slaves to sin.
Yes.
You know, so it's literally the sense of, you know, under the complete subjugation of something. So slavery on the one hand, versus other uses of it is literally just a servant, like a household servant, or somebody working in a household. So the ESV, the preface actually says this when it comes to, there's a footnote with this translation. It says, in hierarchical societies like that of Ephesus, where most people were born into their predetermined niches in the social complex, slaves were simply at the bottom of a long continuum of varying levels of subordination based on birth. And it goes into speaking just a little bit about, you know, the different uses and the different sort of levels in society when this one word governing all the uses. And it says here, so where absolute ownership by a master is envisaged, as in Romans 6, then they use the word slave as the translation. Where a more limited form of servitude is in view, then bondservant is used, you know, as in 1 Timothy. So it's just at very outset to acknowledge that there is a range of uses for doulos, i.e. slave, which is subjugation to a master versus servitude, voluntary servitude. You know, on the other hand. So that's kind of what makes it complicated, and I think we need to deconstruct that a little bit.
So, Rick, let's get into a deeper dive on this subject. You want to unpack the Old Testament usage of slavery?
I don't know if I want to, because it is so complex. But let's try to do this, man. I think it's something that I did have a lot of research on. Didn't make it into the sermon. It couldn't even be one whole sermon on its own, because I think it would need a series on understanding the kind of social hierarchies as they were instituted in the covenant code at Sinai. So Exodus, Leviticus, the law, which we've spoken about in the series. So as they were instituted, these social hierarchies, these ways of governing relationships which include authority, so servants and masters, one of them. As they moved on to then entering the Promised Land in Deuteronomy, it gets repeated with some changes. It's some 40 years after Mount Sinai. Is a repeating of some of these laws governing slaves and masters, and then kind of on into the expression of it through all the sort of stories of the Old Testament onwards. But to be honest with you, we don't actually see the Old Testament people of God behaving in accordance with those commandments. For example, we'll get to this a little bit later, I think, but like the whole year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25. So Leviticus 25 is all about this year of Jubilee, and most commentators would say none of that was actually practiced. We will get into that in a little bit, but kind of it's this whole idea of these hierarchical relationships, including servants and masters, different degrees of it, from slaves to voluntary servants to involuntary servants. And so it's quite complicated and messy, but I feel like it would be helpful to try and navigate our way around it a little bit, because what I did on Sunday is I started at the latest use of the word slavery. So 18th, 19th century African slave trade, which is what we're all conscientized to.
Exactly,
And movies that we watched and etc. And we're all just hyper aware of that context, and even it's still lingering today in some of the race discussions, you know, so we're highly aware of that. So I started there and said that's what we think when we hear the word slavery, is this involuntary, so forceful removal, so and ethnically based, particular people group targeted to be slaves, you know, so involuntary, forceful, lifelong, so when you were kidnapped, as it were, because that's what happened, you just come and take you.
Yeah.
So involuntary or forced, and it was for life. Like there was no sense you had no chance of freedom, and then forced to work menial tasks in appalling conditions that included physical torture, sexual torture, all sorts of abuse. That's slavery as we know it, 18th, 19th century. And I think I want us to remember those words: involuntary, ethnically based, lifelong, abusive servitude. So guys listening, I want them to remember that, because that's what characterizes what we think of slavery, 18th, 19th century, and the emancipation movement, etc. So what I said was they're now going back in time to Ephesus, 1st century, when Paul is writing to Timothy. Slavery then is not that. It was not involuntary, ethnically based, lifelong abusive servitude. So I said it's very, very different. Our slaves were highly educated, doctors, musicians, actors, basically Rome just going, man, we rule the world. Why should we do anything? Let the people we rule. Exactly, so it wasn't ethnically based. It was whatever territories they governed. So Europe, Middle East, Northern Africa, the whole deal. And lots of freedoms, not completely free, etc. So I deconstructed it a little bit, but I was careful to say as well that I didn't want to paint a picture that it was like idealistic. It was still subject to abuse. It was still a social injustice in that slaves had limited rights. They could eventually become citizens, as I mentioned, but while they were slaves, they had really no rights and were often subject to abuse. So it's not like we're painting this idealistic picture of Ephesus, 1st century, slavery then means the modern workplace. And I think I maybe just want to be a little bit careful even about that now, to like directly relate it to the modern workplace. Can I go there for a second? And get to Old Testament. So I think as we come to the idea of, does this translate to the modern workplace? I think what we can say is that while, I'm just going to try to find it here. While it's not the exact same sort of context in that in 1st century Rome, like we in the modern workplace, we're not forced to work, right?
We apply to work.
You don't like your job, the conditions are bad, you leave. You're kind of free to do it. So in some sense, it's not like exactly the same context, and it's so it's not forced and it's not abusive. And if it's abusive, then you just leave. But I think the reason we can apply it to the modern workplace is what we're seeing here in 1 Timothy is that this kind of relationship, the servant-master as expressed here, was the most common kind of employer-employee relationship in the ancient world. There's nothing else. There's no businesses. There was no other context for employer-employee relationship apart from servants and masters. So it means that it is kind of appropriate, even though then in Ephesus it was, less rights, a little more forced and abusive. It was still the only context where employer and employee actually comes up. So we can take from that instructions for the workplace, Secondly, I think it's an argument from the greater to the lesser. I don't know if you or listeners are aware of, like, one of the forms of argument, it's a fortiori kind of argument. It's an argument from the greater to the lesser. So what it means is that if the more complicated thing is true, then it means the lesser thing is true. So like one of the examples I heard, which is really random, is like, so if my wife likes blue, the color blue, then it stands to reason that if I buy her blue jewelry, she'll be happy. You know what I mean? Like, she likes blue. And so if the greater part is true, then the lesser part is true. And the Bible uses this argument a lot. So, for example, Romans 8:32 says, he who did not spare his own son, so God who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also graciously give us all things? Like, if God would give up his son for us, how will he not give us every lesser thing? So in some sense, this situation is, if this applies then in that situation where there's an employer-employee type of relationship, but then there was subject to some abuse, and then it was forced, how much more does it apply to us in a lesser situation where it's not subject to abuse and it's not forced? If, in other words, the instruction to Christians serving under this social structure, this air quote workplace structure includes them honoring their masters in these harsh conditions,
Sure.
how much more does it apply to us when we're not even subject to the same harsh conditions?
Sure.
So I think I just wanted to make that case because
helpful.
that's what we're doing in the ScratchPad here is like answering questions. And even though there's not necessarily a question around it, I would have that question.
Yeah.
You know, again, we're trying to understand the language of servant and master.
Yeah.
And what does that mean today? Just like a few weeks ago, Brett had to understand the language of the widows and the list, this mysterious list. And what does that mean today? Like, this is what we do in Bible study.
Yeah.
With this case of slaves/servants and masters, we have to do quite a bit of work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Deconstruct slavery as we know it today.
Sure.
Look at the context then, which wasn't exactly the office, you know, but the closest we have in the New Testament to our current office, and worse so.
Yeah.
So if what Paul says was true to them, then how much more is it true to us today?
I like that, and I think it's helpful to deconstruct these things. I mean, I've often heard a lot of guys that I've related to over the years, like in ministry or sharing the gospel, and they'll say, well, Christianity is a white man's religion, but they only taking the last couple of 100 years into account and not looking the entirety of history. And I think in particularly when you're dealing with such hot button topics, it's helpful just to deconstruct that, so that we look at how these things were used. Unfortunately, such passages have been used, even during slavery to promote it. But the deconstruction, I think that's a valuable thing for us in the 21st century as we engage with scripture and as we engage with social issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this does apply to the workplace, and I think that the application was there sort of in the sermon on Sunday.
Yes.
So it certainly does apply, but we have to navigate through the language of servant/slave. And I think when we get to the actual workplace instruction, it become clear to everybody listening. Because I didn't spend too much time on it on Sunday. I spent more time on the principle of why we would do this and its gospel implications, because it's missional, etc. That was the sermon teaching moment, was the motivation, that the teaching is not reviled.
And there's a very interesting book that I've read, and I probably want to go back to it, by Tim Keller. Every Good Endeavor.
Yes,
so it touches on. It's a great book. I mean, I would highly recommend it.
Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller. Those who missed it.
Exactly. It's just a helpful book.
On the workplace.
Talking about the workplace, because there is a missional component to us in the workplace.
Yes, and our attitude in it.
Our attitude,
which is what Paul was describing to Timothy, to Christians in the workplace, as it were. We'll get to those cross references in a little bit. So I think listeners, just hold on, because you'll see just how clearly this obviously applies to the workplace.
Exactly,
but on the front end, as we're talking about slavery and servants, thought it would be helpful to just make sure guys are really tracking along with understanding how we get to the workplace from slavery. So it was 18th, 19th century, then to first century sort of Greco-Roman era slavery. Then I wanted to backtrack then even more to the concept of slavery as it arises in the Old Testament, in the original household code, as it were. Again, in inverted commas. And we'll talk about the household code in the New Testament, which has been for me one of the major takeaways from this series.
It's amazing how that has come up, and I want us to go there to recap on these household codes. Because it's again the beauty of going through like a book of the Bible. Like, I mean, honestly, that's been massive for me.
Good.
Going through that, I'm like, wow, this is.
I think it should be one of the big takeaways.
It is, man. Like, it's so helpful. It's instructions on how Christians have to relate to others, right, in different spheres of society, in government, in the home, in the church, in the form of leaders, and we've dealt with that. So let's get into that, Rich.
Do you want to get into that now? Do you want to do the slavery bit first, the original household code?
Let's go there. Hey? Let's go. You want to go there?
Yeah, man. Let's just try go there a little bit, and then we'll get to the household code. So kind of Old Testament, Mount Sinai, the law. That's another for me personally. That one sermon, the lawful use of the law.
Yes.
And I think I've said it on this podcast, but I'll say it again. Probably spend more time on that sermon than any other sermon almost ever.
Sure.
Maybe apart from the woman in the church, but that because they had all the other research.
They had all the other stuff
but so this kind of idea of this original law code given to the people of God and its principles that still apply today. So before we get to the New Testament household codes, as you've accurately described them, which describe or give instruction on how to live in these social structures of society, the original household code. The Levitical laws on Mount Sinai that governed everything in immense detail, even oxes treading out grain and muzzling. Remember that?
I remember that.
So I think going back to the kind of what we think of when we think slavery, involuntary, ethnically based, lifelong, abusive servitude. What's interesting is when it gets to these Old Testament household codes, you can immediately see that that's not what's been spoken about in the subject of slavery. So, for example, Exodus 21, verse 16 is quite important here. And maybe I could just mention to guys in general who want to go and look at the Old Testament text. So, Exodus 21 is your key text, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25. So, Exodus 21 is laws about slaves. So, there you go. It's the household code. And the word slaves were like, ooh, what does this mean? Does it mean involuntary, ethnic-based, lifelong abusive servitude or what? And then in verse 16 is an important one as it sets up this subject. It says, whoever steals a man and sells him, does that ring any bells?
Sure.
Steals a man and sells him.
Yeah.
So we're talking about kind of colonial African slavery, like that idea. So like you're going, okay, yes, that's what we think about when we think slavery. We think human trafficking, we're thinking going and just poaching someone from their house and selling them to slavery. It says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of that sold person.
Sure.
What does it say there? It says, shall be put to death.
Sure.
Right? So that like kind of, it's a key text. It's a key text for, I'm going to tell you this whole thing is really complicated and I don't understand all of it, but like this is one part we all understand clearly.
It's very clear.
Very clearly, like if you are a slave trader and you go and you capture somebody and sell them, this text of the people of God is like, and Zwai, people in possession.
Yes.
You kind of buy them. So already you've got this idea of we're not talking in this whole Old Testament code governing servants, masters, slaves. Again, it's not going to be idealistic, but it's not African slave trade.
Sure.
As we know it. You can already see
that
that
is so helpful,
Exodus
man.
21.
I've never come across this part of scripture.
Yeah, and it goes on. So I came across it, I'll just tell you and listeners. So I preached through Exodus 2 years ago. Some of the most fun I've ever had. I can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, we need to do that.
But like we had to wrestle with this, and I came across it. And by the way, let me just read a passage that's going to make it even harder for people. So let's see. Verse 7 of Exodus 21. So laws about slavery. When a man sells his daughter as a slave. Zwai, what are you thinking there?
Sure.
Hey, are you thinking, I got a daughter? It's like,
sure.
When a man sells his daughter as a slave, again, now we're thinking, if you didn't hear verse 16, you're thinking, oh my goodness, who could do that?
Yes.
She shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, this female slave that has been sold by her father, let's just remember, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food as in the slave that she just bought from the father. He shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out
free
for nothing, without or freely, without payment of money. So again, you're like, what? You see, if you read this from an external perspective, you're going, what father would sell his daughter as a slave? And you're thinking African slave trade, forced removal, lifelong abusive servitude. But kind of the Old Testament code is really the sense here is the idea is a family in great poverty.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Old Testament slavery servant codes, especially governing relationships among Israelites themselves, were, so the situation is a family, the father has, like, they don't have enough food even for themselves.
Yeah.
So kind of gives her over into another family.
Sure.
And in that family, now she's taken as a wife
Yeah.
by the man. So it's almost like a dowry,
Yeah.
a bride price.
Lobola, yeah.
Exactly.
It is, yeah.
So it's a bride price to be his wife. If he decides he doesn't want her as his wife, she can be his son's wife per se. Or if he gets another wife, there's all these things protecting her.
Yeah.
Protecting her. She's got to be treated as his wife, even if he doesn't intend to take her as wife. She must be treated, must be given status as a wife. And if she's given as a wife to the son, she's given status as a daughter.
Exactly, yeah.
And if they're like, man, this isn't working out like for us, she goes out free.
Yeah.
So it's even here is this idea of it's not this involuntary, ethnically based, lifelong sort of servitude. And again, guys, got to remember that in the Old Testament especially, so we spoke about first century, there was no corporations or businesses. You know, so employer-employee relationship was in the context of servant and master. In Old Testament, even more so, were there no businesses, right?
Sure.
And employers, employees. Every kind of relationship or industry. If you worked for someone, you worked for a household. If you worked for someone, you worked for a household. And so when you worked as their employee in a household, the language used there is this language of servant as master, and they sort of, these Old Testament codes do describe that relationship in ways of like, they own you, so it'll use language like that, they're your possession, but it doesn't mean in terms of forced servitude, abusive, lifelong sense. It means essentially they owned rights to your labor. They didn't own you as a person.
Yes.
So one of the great examples I heard about this that I think has a modern day equivalent, and I think it's absolutely spot on. If you're trying to understand what it means to own rights to the labor without owning the person, just think about the current trading of human beings in the realm of soccer. No jokes, man.
That's true.
When you as a player get bought out by a club, would we say you're enslaved to them?
They're not,
Would we say they own you as a person?
Sure.
No. But they own your labor.
Yeah.
You can't go play for another team.
Yes.
Right?
You cannot.
And they trade you like cattle.
No, that's a spot on. Actually, it's a spot on example.
Absolutely spot on. They use the word trading. And so gets traded for so-and-so. It's like slavery.
Yeah.
But we all know it's not slavery because it's not forced.
Yeah.
It's voluntary. It's employment.
The players enjoy it.
The players enjoy it. They have freedoms. They got all sorts of things. But the language is no. The club owns not you, but rights to your labor.
To use you,
and they trade those rights to your labor for other players or for money. I mean, it amazes me. The language used in professional sports in teams is language of slavery.
Example, man. That's a spot on example. I mean, unfortunately, your club, Kaizer Chiefs, they don't know how to follow those rules. Which is why they had the ban.
But thanks, Zwai, taking the opportunity to continue our Pirates Chiefs battle here. But this is what we're talking about. Old Testament, this kind of context of when you read these texts governing the people of God, the Israelite people themselves, it's often a sense of out of poverty, going and working for, as it were, another household. But in a sense, the language used is of servant and master, and there are certain kind of ownership language, but it's not much different to professional sports sort of language today. There's great freedom in it. So this is where Leviticus 25 comes up. So even there it's mentioned in Deuteronomy 15, it's mentioned every 7th year, slaves
set
go
free.
So it's not lifelong.
Yeah.
It's like to ensure that over time people don't get abused,
Yes.
caught in cycles
Yeah.
like this. So it's this principle every 7th year. And then on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, which is a little bit more complicated, it seems
Yeah.
like even perhaps slaves from outside of Israel would be set free. And that's a little bit more complicated and contested and hard to understand. But in other words, there are just a lot of rules governing the authority structures between the people of God. In the Old Testament, where there be no businesses, no corporations, it was all households
Yeah.
and household servants. And so the language used, all of that is governing those interactions.
Sure.
So I don't know if that's
That is super helpful.
but
Super
it
helpful.
might help people a little bit as they're reading, like, for example, Exodus 21 and reading stuff from fathers selling their
Yeah.
daughters into slavery. And like, no,
Yeah.
it's actually setting her up,
Yeah.
for...
Which I mean, just to go on a bit of a tangent, I think that's why we do the ScratchPad. I think I've read up about polygamy as well from an African context, and they said one of the reasons polygamy existed, it wasn't just because the man has a sexual appetite that he needs to feed, but it was largely around helping a family that's struggling.
Right.
So by bringing in that daughter and creating relations between these families, the impoverished family
Yes.
would have benefits within the new family. So that was one reason. The other one was in the case when the wife is not able to bear kids. The wife would actually say, hey, do you, speaking to her husband, would say, don't you think we need to get somebody to assist?
Like Rachel and Leah.
Yes,
type thing.
exactly.
Yes.
So it's helped me to understand, not that I would promote polygamy, that's because the Bible is very clear, but just, I think, understanding things like that, just to understand the origins.
Yes, the origins of it.
Yes.
I think it's a good example. I think polygamy is something that we see changing through the
Yes.
Old Covenant, New Covenant, but in the Old Testament it had a place.
It had a place.
And here as well, in Exodus 21, is
Yeah.
if the man who now has received this daughter
Yes.
as a wife now gets another wife, he can't cast her out.
Exactly.
So she's under his
Yeah.
protection and under his provision. So yeah, a lot of these principles that we read Old Testament with 21st century eyes
Yeah.
make no sense, but in their original context,
Sure.
the actual instructions are actually for the flourishing of human life
Yeah.
in this especially Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, nomadic people
Yeah.
who are being formed into the people of God, yet to take their place as a nation, as it
Sure.
were, with civil laws and stuff. So it's all like so important
Yeah.
to understand the context. But the principles, remember,
Yeah.
the principles apply.
Exactly.
And so you got this development from the shaping of the people of God at Mount Sinai with the households and servants within them and rules within them. New Testament, you've got that being expressed, the same kinds of principles,
Sure.
but in a very different society, and you can extract that today to
Yeah.
sort of the workplace. But just to kind of close out the discussion on
Sure.
Old Testament sort of slavery thing, it's just to say that if you read the Old Testament codes as they're written for how the people of God treated each other within these contexts, it is without parallel in any other ancient law codes. No other people group and code governing people groups. And we have codes governing people groups from that time.
Yeah.
Nowhere else are there such rights afforded to people in these kind of employer-employee relationships that are bound within households and all that
Sure.
goes with it. Like, it was without parallel. It was a shining light to the nations around is
Yes.
how they treated each other
Exactly.
when it came to helping the impoverished by receiving them into your
Sure.
family and in marriage and all the protection and we could go into just other texts around governing these relationships which disallowed for any kind of abuse. So remember, what we think of slavery is involuntary, forced,
Abusive,
lifelong.
exactly.
We've seen those are not Old
Yeah.
Testament cases.
Exactly.
It is sort of voluntary yourself to help. It's not lifelong because there's a 7-year cycle.
Exactly.
Texts about abuse, like if someone abuses a slave, there's a retribution to that
Exactly.
master if they
Vehemently,
physically harm
yeah.
them. Like, you cannot think 18th, 19th century slavery because of the protections afforded to
Yes.
servants in these relationships. So there's
Sure.
all of those 4 categories that I mentioned when we think slavery didn't exist in
That's
the
so
First Timothy
helpful.
case, don't exist in the Old Testament.
That is so
case.
helpful. I think it solves so many issues. I think currently that the world is facing the issue of social justice. That
Yes.
ties into it, but which is a different subject.
Well, that's where it gets
altogether.
complicated, though, is like the Jubilee thing. Because I
Sure.
heard a podcast and a guy who was talking about like solutions to world problems. It was referencing Jubilee. I was like, phew, man, that's like, I need to do a lot more homework on that.
Yeah.
Thought about that. But it
Sure.
is this interesting paradigm that doesn't seem like that people of God actually did. But yes, you're right. So I said getting to these principles and understanding them
Yeah.
in context of our relationship with one another, in the context of church, is supposed to be helpful. So I know we took a lot more time on that than
I think we needed to. Rich, let's dive into the recap on the household codes. Like we've articulated before, like it's the instructions to Christians as to how to relate to others in society. In relation to government, homes, church, and those things have come up.
yes, all of
Certainly
those
in this
areas.
series, they've come through.
So I think it's just something I did not anticipate coming out as strongly as it did in the series, this collection of household codes. And maybe we won't spend a lot of time on this because we did spend a lot of time on the slavery, but just to kind of, recap. So First Peter does this. He tracks these different levels of how we relate to government, which is to be in submission to and to honor. How we relate in the home, so wives, submitting to husbands, and husbands sort of loving wives, or Peter uses different language, but to be familiar with that language. Timothy tracks through those same things. We started with, first of all, pray for all of those kings and those in government, remember? And so it follows that exact same progression of Christians to their government, to women and wives and husbands in marriage. By the way, also included is children to parents
Exactly,
in that household code. And then he goes from there into the church, so members to their leaders, and then also those overlap of role of men and women within church structures, and then into the workplace. So that's the collection of household codes governing those relationships, and all of them do have this idea of honoring or submitting to, not based on any sense of difference in value. We don't submit to the government because they're intrinsically more worthy,
more valuable than us.
It's because God has imposed these or instituted these structures to enable human flourishing, even when it doesn't make sense. And that's why, even like for example, Romans, it says to be absolutely in submission to those in governing authorities. So it's these structures that God has implemented to enable human flourishing, government, in the church, in the home, and in the workplace. And I think you have to read these workplace instructions in that sense of, yes, there is these strange servants, honor your masters. And work hard for they will benefit from it. The masters will benefit from it, which we'll get to in a moment. But it's like it doesn't make sense. But again, it's in this greater context of the household codes, structures that God has given to enable human flourishing. And if we abide in those ways, we will flourish, and the people around us will flourish. So
and I think there's a redemptive impact to it as well. I think there's parts of scripture that talk about, the way we work so as to please God, not man. And also there's a display of excellence on the part of Christians, which I think is one of those, being a showcase community to the world. Like we work hard, we work hard, we work excellently for God's glory. But there's something beautiful that it's displaying in community, particularly in the workplace. Regardless of the conditions, that you find yourselves in.
I think that's the key, is we don't work hard, just to display a good work ethic, We work hard even when it doesn't seem to benefit us.
Exactly.
Because again, that's highlighting the gospel. It's
Yeah.
illuminating this. We were given honor even
Yeah.
though we didn't deserve honor.
Yeah.
So when you honor those above you, even when
Yeah.
perhaps, especially when they don't deserve it,
Yeah.
you are illuminating the gospel. When you do the opposite, when you only give honor when it's due, you're discrediting this gospel message,
Yeah.
which says, no, that's not how the
Yeah.
gospel works.
Yeah.
And I think the same when it comes to working hard and work ethic. And that's where verse 2 comes in, which you maybe need to get to for a little bit, because that's going to be fun. We'll continue our translation war here. But verse 2, does seem to,
Yeah.
I think, speak about that. So we're working hard, even though you don't know, it may not come back to you now in an earthly sense, but may even seem to benefit others and not you.
True.
We do it because the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Yeah.
So our work ethic isn't just displaying we work hard, because that could be for our own reward.
Yeah, exactly.
Work hard and you'll
Yeah.
have a great life. So
Yeah.
no, we're working hard to serve
To serve, yeah.
those around us, the companies, the bosses. Oof, that's
Which is
one.
a hard one. I mean, I've a friend of mine, very close friend of mine from university. He's in a particularly difficult work environment, and we've spoken about this. Just like we're called though to work hard.
Yeah.
To work hard, and even though you feel like, to what end, to what benefit is this for me? But we work hard, and submit to those in authority.
Honor them. Yeah, and I think that's the one cross-reference that I mentioned on Sunday. Maybe we can get into cross-references, and then we'll finish with our verse 2 contest. But like the cross-reference I read on Sunday, Colossians 3. So this is, again, the part I mentioned earlier, where listeners, hey, we're talking about the workplace, and this becomes clear now. So Colossians 3, I'll read Colossians 3, then maybe you can read Ephesians 6.
Yeah.
And we'll just read some of these cross-references. So Colossians 3, before it gets to bond servants, which is what I read on Sunday.
Yeah.
Bond servants, again, that's doulos. You could translate it
Yes.
slaves, so that's not part of the translation war. It's accurate to say slaves or bond servants. But before it gets to bond servants, it says what? Household code stuff. Wives,
Yeah,
submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and don't be harsh with them. Does this language sound familiar? Paul's going to repeat this in Ephesians as he tracks through the household code. So wives to husbands, husbands to wives, part 1 of the household code. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord.
Sure.
So children, then fathers, don't provoke your
Yes.
children. So household code.
Yeah.
Then bond servants. So see, it's not out on its own, the
Yeah.
workplace. It's
There's
within the household
within the-
codes,
yeah.
these authority structures where there's submission, even when it's not deserved, and it's not based on value. It's these structures that God has placed. So bond servants, obey in everything your earthly masters. And not just as people pleasers, so you're not doing it to get recognition, but with sincerity of heart,
Sure.
fearing the Lord.
Yeah.
See, that's the motivation, like working hard, because goes on to say, whatever you do, work heartily.
Yeah.
Work heartily. Why? As for the Lord,
Sure.
not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ. Like, it could not be more specific. Your
Yeah.
friend
Sure.
that work hard.
Exactly.
It's not work hard so you can please people. It's not work hard that you will receive reward. I mean, for the most part in the modern workplace, you work hard, it gets recognized, you will maintain. If you work hard with a good attitude, you're going to go places. But even if you don't, you receive the inheritance from the Lord as your reward. Like, it's clear as day,
it's
a
massive,
Christian
man.
work ethic. And it's
Yeah.
within the context of household code.
Yeah.
So you read Ephesians
I've got
6?
Ephesians 6, which kicks off with what my children need to do. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right.
Yes.
Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth.
Amen.
Shoo. I'm going to have it,
Put on our
printed
kids'
out, yeah.
walls.
Exactly. Remember that. And then he gets into, fathers, how they should relate. It says, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So fathers are not off the hook here, And then verse 5 gets to slaves.
Yep.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you are serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him.
He's like rephrasing Colossians.
Yeah,
it
is.
And I think we need to recognize that.
Sure.
It's not like it's repeated all over.
Yeah.
And First Peter, so it's within the family,
Sure.
then the church, and then it is in the workplace. And it's the same thing, not
Yeah.
so that people can see and reward you, knowing that you're working for the Lord and that He will
Yeah.
reward you.
And these things are not coming out of a vacuum. Particularly, I mean, in
Yes.
Ephesians, he's dealt with doctrine, the first couple of
Exactly.
chapters, and he's looking at the outworking of that. Like, then how does it impact on our living? Right?
Exactly.
So it's not just
It's godliness.
it's godliness, man.
It's
Like,
godliness. It's
you know,
how your relationship to Christ
Sure.
changes your relationship with the
Yeah.
world. Another reference, cross-reference, Titus 2. So this is Paul, the same what we call pastoral epistles.
Yeah.
So he's writing to Timothy, who's pastoring a church, and he's writing to Titus, and look, same thing. Slaves are to be submissive to their masters in everything. And now we understand slaves, we understand masters, and to be well-pleasing, not talking back or stealing, but demonstrating utter faithfulness, so that they may adorn the teaching of God our Savior in everything. This gospel root there. So he's just quoting to Titus and Timothy, saying the same thing. Two
Yeah.
pastors, two different churches,
Yeah.
saying the same thing. And as he's writing to in the church at Colossae and at Ephesus, he's extracting the household codes. It's just all part of how we work in this world in
Yeah.
relationship with each other. Let's close by doing the verse 2 bit, which will just, I think, get to the heart of why you would work hard even though you're not going to get rewarded. So
Yeah.
Zwai on Team NRV.
Yes, verse 2, this is what it says. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves.
Okay, so listeners, we are playing Spot the Difference.
Yeah.
Okay, so just read that last sentence again because this
Okay.
is just going to be really interesting and I think really helpful. Read the last sentence
All
again.
right. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves.
Okay, so it's saying, so you serve even masters who aren't Christians, work hard. And those who are Christians, even though they don't need the gospel, work even harder.
Yeah.
And it says the motivation is because those masters love you and are, what's the wording there again?
Because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves.
The masters are devoted to the welfare of the slaves, which sounds great.
Yeah.
That's an instruction to bosses to be devoted to the welfare of their employees.
Exactly,
Now,
yeah.
here's ESV. So rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. So it's saying you must serve, work harder, because the ones that you are benefiting by your service are your bosses and
Yeah.
believers. They're saying the exact opposite thing.
It is.
The NIV is saying work hard because your masters are devoted to your welfare.
Yeah.
ESV is saying work hard
because
because
it
your
benefits
master
them.
will benefit.
Yeah.
So who's the benefactor here and
Sure.
who's the beneficiary? And the reality is in the translation it's not clear. I would argue, I'm on team ESV,
ESV.
here, I would argue that ESV's got it right because I think that actually magnifies this gospel emphasis even more. If you're working harder because it's going to come back to you, that doesn't have a gospel emphasis.
Yeah.
This emphasis is you're working hard, even though it's benefiting them and not you.
Yeah.
That's going to display the gospel.
Sure.
Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
ESV
What?
3-1. But okay, let me help you out there because
It
I
is
know you're
3-1,
struggling
yeah.
with this. But I think when there's ambiguity like this in the Bible,
We should call it a draw.
No, we shouldn't. But it's meant to lead to these conversations because there's a mutual beneficiary
Benefits,
happening here. And isn't that in the household code, Zwai? So when it says children honor your parents, it also says parents don't exasperate your children.
Exactly, yeah.
And when it
Both
says
ways.
wives submit to your husbands, also says husbands
Love
love
your
your
wife.
wives and
Yeah.
sacrifice for her.
Yeah.
There's always this within this acceptance of these structures, an honoring and a submitting, but there's also instruction given to those in authority,
Sure.
which is supposed to benefit those under authority. So the ambiguity here is saying that, so actually we could extract from this principle, slaves, when you do this, yes, it benefits, say, your masters, but in this way, there's a mutually beneficial relationship being set up, which should be between Christians. A Christian boss should be concerned for the welfare of the servant, and the servant should be serving, for the company. And Philemon, the whole book of Philemon, is the story of the slave, and Paul is convincing Philemon to take back Onesimus, the slave, who's now not longer a slave but a brother. So it's actually speaking to masters, and in the Ephesians code, it talks a lot to masters. So it's correct for us to have this ambiguity and to recognize, hey, there's a mutually beneficial relationship. But if you're going to pick the actual translation, you've got to go with those who benefit because that
displays the gospel. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So and I think my bias with citing you on this one with ESV, it's because it's in terms of the spectrum of translations, it's more closer, again, the closest thing is the actual,
original Greek text.
The Greek text, but it's more closer in terms of the paraphrasing, because I think the more you go that way, it's more paraphrased and translated, that it's lost some. So outside with the ESV.
Wow, okay, you're giving me this one.
Because of that.
But I played the God card, right?
Look, you did.
I played the gospel card. I said
so
the gospel.
Still, the score is 2-1.
3-1. Wow, 3-1.
I thought this one is a draw.
Chiefs Pirates. 3-1 Chiefs.
We'll see when the season starts. Sure.
I think that's probably all we've got time for today. I hope it's I know the slavery bit is complicated, and especially the Old Testament sense, but I really hope that somehow we, through guys listening and through this discussion, are able to get a handle on the language and extract principles from it.
Absolutely.
Understand the context in the Old Testament better, in first century Ephesus better. Because I think there are just some huge questions against it. So hopefully that's been helpful. Yeah.
And if you've got any questions, we want to invite you still to interact with us. Send your questions, send your thoughts. We'd love to hear how this is landing on your side. Otherwise, we'll catch you next week on the next episode.
Cheers, everyone.
ScratchPad. Bye-bye.